Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're up to episode number 30 on the in the Ruy Lopez. This is the Yates variation we're going to take a look at, which is the last of the significant deviations before we get to the main lines where white plays h3 on move 9. So this is also well, you could think of it as a kind of a two-way variation. So it's both usable as an anti-martial. So the anti-martial move order goes like this: castles, d4, b6, c3. So there's that. But you can also play it, let's say, freely, without compulsion. So the mainline systems begin, of course, with h3. This will be the focus of our last three shows in the Ruy series. So let me briefly say what those will be on. So we'll cover the Zaitsev variation with bishop to b7. We'll discuss the Chigorin with knight a5, bishop c2, and as we're doing that, we'll discuss d5, and I think we'll also discuss the Gaevsky, or the accelerated Gaevsky variation as well. So we'll discuss what that is, in fact, later. So that's basically what you get in this move order. So castles, c3, knight a5, bishop c2, and now d5. All right, so we'll hit those when we're discussing the Chigorin, and then I think we'll conclude with the Breyer. So normally I would conclude with the Chigorin, but the Breyer is just so much more popular nowadays that we'll make that the main line. And within all of these, we'll discuss both d4 and d3. So I was thinking about doing a separate show on d3, but I think we'll just combine these. So in the Breyer, we'll discuss d3 as well as d4. Ditto for the Chigorin, the regular Chigorin, that is. So c5, and then both d3 and d4. And likewise, as I said, for the Zaitsev. Although in the Zaitsev, d3 is much less common than d4. So in the other systems, I would say the percentages are closer, but less so here. All right, anyway, that's what's to come. So for now, let's get back to the Zaitsev. So d4, not the Zaitsev, the Yates, excuse me. And now bishop to g4. So this is the concession that white's making by playing d4 right away and not playing h3. Now you might wonder back here, well, why not play bishop to g4 straight away then, if this is such a wonderful thing? And the answer is that bishop to g4 is effective in the Yates because it's putting pressure against white's pawn on d4. White, by playing d4, whenever he plays it, whether here in the Yates or in some mainline position, let's say this Zaitsev position, the pawn on d4 is effective. And sometimes you may want to push, but not always. Sometimes you want to put pressure on e5. Here, for instance, black can't really play, well, he could play knight a5, perhaps, de, and then maybe he can take on e4, but sooner or later, if black wants to remaneuver this knight, he's going to have to do something about the pawn on e5, or let's say in here. Okay, so it's not attacked yet, but now after d4 in the Chigorin, black has to do something about the pawn on e5. So either he's going to make a capture, or he'll play knight to d7, or he'll play queen c7, or knight back to c6. But in one way or another, he has to react to this. And often in so doing, he has to make concessions. Well, here, it's white who has to make the concessions. It's very difficult for white to maintain the pawn in place. Well, when you play bishop to g4 first, however, there's no pressure against the pawn on d4. So what white will do is generally play something like d3, although a4 can be played as well, but just d3. Let's say black castles. Now knight b to d2. And this bishop, in fact, not only doesn't exert any pressure on white's center, but it's going to be in danger of being rounded up. So white will play the usual maneuver, the knight to f1, and then either knight e3 or h3, and if the bishop goes to g3, you play knight g3, and the bishop just kind of ends up getting in black's way. So white will first take care of this bishop one way or another, either chase it back along that diagonal, the diagonal it came from, Or if it goes to h5, maybe it'll get exchanged with knight to g3, knight h4, knight f5, or just taking. And then white can play d4 in peace. So white has scored very well in this system. So bishop to g4 is really rare for that reason. But after castles in d4, now bishop to g4 is very sensible. All right, so white has really two ways of dealing with the threat to the to his center. Well, the threat of bishop takes f3. You could, I suppose, play g takes f3, but it doesn't. Again, it's not a terribly popular way for white to respond. So he usually either plays d5 or bishop to e3. Now, there are some closed rules where white doesn't mind playing d5, but generally that's when black has already committed the bishop to b7, when he's going to have to waste some time bringing it back to c8. It's also nice to sometimes play d5 in a Chigorin where black has already committed the knight to a5, because then it's going to take it several tempi to find its way back to a good spot. But here, well, the funny thing is, the knight does end up going to a5, but because the bishop's not on b7, it's not really such a big deal. So the Breyer approach is not quite as good as it would be. The reason is that black is going to play c6 sooner or later. And by playing knight to a5, you extract a tempo gain out of white. White's going to keep his bishop with bishop c2, and now c6. All right, so from here, in fact, this is still mainline theory. White has tried two different moves here, main moves here, d takes c6 and h3. So if dc, in many positions, black would just happily play knight c6, but here he can extract even more by playing queen c7, taking with the queen, and then putting the knight on c4. So knight b to d2, queen c6, knight f1. And black has played lots and lots of moves here. They all seem to be good enough for equality, both in theory and practice. So I'll just give one suggestion here. This is the move recommended by both Houdini, the chess engine, and Larry Kaufman in his book, what's it called? Something like the Chess Repertoire in Black and White. Sorry, the Kaufman Repertoire in Black and White. And so there he recommends bishop e6 and gives this as his main line and says that black has solved the problem of his bad knight on a5. Well, it's really not such a bad knight on a5 because it generally ends up getting well placed on c4 when white's knight goes to e3. Anyway, black has done very well in this this setup and is equal here. I would agree. So instead of dc, another move that white plays more commonly is h3, which is not a bad idea. Trying to force this bishop to pick a diagonal, and then white decides on how he's going to play after that. So here, black can play the greedy bishop takes f3, but I think white stands pretty well here, at least in practical terms. So queen f3, takes, and now the knight reroutes over to b6. And white just gives up the pawn. He doesn't bother with bishop to b3. Now, this is playable, as I said, for black, but it's very dangerous, and in fact, white has scored reasonably well. So knight b takes d5, knight g3. White's got the bishop here. The knight is ready to jump into f5, which is obviously a very attractive square. And so the following is kind of possible. So knight e6, a4, and here b4 is a good move. But still, queen b7, rook e8, takes. And I think with the bishop pair, and now even material, white stands a little bit better. So you guys who play this with black, you can play this bishop takes f3 move, but you need to be careful. White's bishops are quite dangerous there, as is the f5 square for the white knight. So I think it's much safer and probably objectively better to play bishop c8. Okay, dc, queen c7, knight b to d2, queen c6, knight f1, and here, Kaufman recommends bishop e6, which is fine too. Knight g3, rook a to c8. And this occurred in the game Navarre-Bilyavsky, and I think other games too. And black is fine. Bilyavsky is in general a very good guy to follow in the closed rule if you play it. So he's been playing this system for, I don't know, 30 years now, 20, 25, 30 years. And is really just a virtuoso of the opening. So of course, you know, he loses games. We saw a game that he lost to Carlsen in a D3 early D3 system, but nevertheless, he's done very well even against Carlsen. He's got some good games against him in the closed Roy. All right. Well, instead of bishop to e6, though, my own recommendation would be for knight to c4. All right. Knight to g3 and rook e8. And here, white has tried two main moves, b3 and a4. On b3, the knight b6. Well, the gain for white is that he's kicked out the knight. That's obviously good, but the c3 pawn is a bit of a target. So bishop e3, knight b to d7, bishop to d2, knight c5, rook c1. And we're following a recent rapid game, Ismagambetov versus Carlsen, played in Astana in 2012. Again, this was, I think, back in June, maybe even July of this year, 2012. But here Carlsen played bishop to e6, and I don't remember what Black played, but there's a nice trick that White has here, knight to d4, and I think this gives White decent chances for an advantage. The point being, of course, if e takes d4, cd4, and then there's d5. So I think the better move here is bishop to b7, and this I think is equal. So, it's sometimes nice to have the bishop on c8, keeping an eye on bf5 square, but the pressure against e4, the possibility of playing a quick d5, gives Black sufficient counterplay. All right. I should say also that queen to c7 is a decent move too. So sidestepping the fork. So in other words, bishop e6, knight to d4, e takes d4, cd4, knight moves, and then d5. So now there's no fork on d5. And this is kind of a nice flexible way of treating the position, waiting to see what White does before committing the bishop from c8 one way or another. So I think this is equal. So instead of b3, there's also a4, which is, I think, more common. And now, again, Black has tried both bishop to b7 and bishop to e6. And as the latter, I think, is scored better and is more common at the highest levels, we'll stick to that. So bishop to e6, knight g5, bishop d7, b3. And here, for a change, knight to b6 is not very good because of a5. So this is why White plays knight to g5. So you force the bishop to d7, so you take away the knight's best second retreat square. But knight a5, bishop to d2, and here the most common move is queen to c7, and then Black will probably end up playing bishop f8, h6, g6, bishop g7. Typical Ruy Lopez remaneuver. But a very interesting alternative here is bishop to d8, setting the bishop to b6 instead. So play can continue knight h5, h6, takes, knight f3, queen c7. So the bishop didn't end up there after all, but this exchange on f6 is not a bad one for Black. And the bishop may reroute to b6 anyway. Also, the bishop on f6, by not having played g6, it keeps the king side a bit more secure. Anyway, after AB, we'll leave the game Adam Zeronian from Dortmund in 2006 here. Black is doing absolutely fine, and the game was eventually drawn. All right, so that is all I want to say about d5. We'll consider bishop to e3, our main line, and, follows a number of Sutovsky's games. So Emil Sutovsky, the very strong Israeli grandmaster and theoretician, has been a pretty decent fan of this the setup for White. So he's the guy that I would recommend following if you're interested in playing the Yates for White. All right, so here White is trying to maintain the pawn on d4, and Black has, well, I was going to say he has a choice, but really not. If he plays knight to a5 here, then d takes e5 is quite effective. So it forces bishop f3, queen f3, d takes e5, and now White can choose, I should say, of course, if knight takes b3, e takes f6 is very good. So de, and now White can choose between trying to keep and use the bishops in the long run with bishop to c2, or play knight to d2. Since knight takes b3 is not really very attractive just yet. Anyway, I think White should feel optimistic here. I would probably prefer knight to d2, but both are fine, and I would recommend against knight to a5 for those of you considering this with Black. So e takes d4, c takes d4, and again, we've got a little parting of the ways here. Black can choose d5 or knight a5, and d5 might be the more secure route, to be honest. Well, let's look at that first. It's, I think, less common than knight a5. Yeah, it is, but they both score pretty similarly. Anyway, on d5, white plays e5, and so we end up with kind of an open Rui style position. Knight e4, knight c3, takes, and here black chooses between queen d7, which enables him to meet bishop to c2 with bishop to f5, and also prepares knight to e6, which is a fairly useful move to play. With the knight on e6, the c5 square is covered. F5 can sometimes be very good there, and so even if white doesn't take en passant, then the e5 pawn is pre-blockaded. The knight on e6 also closes the diagonal from a2 to g8 further. Anyway, let's take a look at a little bit of theory. So h3, and here black often wants to play bishop to f5, but doesn't do it right away because of bishop to g5 by white. So bishop g5 is of course impossible when the bishop is on h5 due to the knight on f3 being pinned. So bishop h5. Here sometimes g4 is played, but usually bishop c2, knight to d8, and here again g4 can be played. Also a4 is sometimes played, trying to take advantage of the break in communication between the rooks, and in case of knight e6, maybe bishop f5. So queen of b1 is the main move, though, hitting h7 and breaking the pin. So bishop g6 takes, and here both recaptures are possible. And again, black is approximately equal, though maybe white has some small chances for an advantage. So it's more common for black to play knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4. All right, and now white has tried a couple of moves. The safe and sound approach is queen d3, g6, bishop h6. So white breaks the pin without doing any damage to his pawn structure in this way. Rook e8. And now, oddly, it would seem, white plays white sometimes plays queen to e2. And it looks kind of funny to jump back into the pin, but with h3 coming, the pin can't be maintained. So queen d7, h3, bishop f5, and this is equal. Sometimes white starts with h3, but it's the same thing. Bishop f5, queen e2, queen d7. All right, so this line is equal and not really very promising for white. So a more interesting try is to play h3 immediately. Bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, and now bishop to f5. So this stops queen d7, and it keeps the play very, very sharp. Black generally goes for queenside counterplay here. a5, and now bishop f4 is the move we're going to look at, but I'll note that queen d3 is also possible and has often been successful, though the engine claims that black is doing just fine after a number of moves. Rook to b8, rook a6, bishop f5, and some others too. All right, so bishop f4, b4. And here the computer says that black is slightly better. But in the real world, where people are actually playing chess, white has gone +4 out of 7 games with the move h4. And so this is really a test here. Houdini says that black is clearly better at this point, and Kaufman is also a bit skeptical, even though he lost with this. So he lost to this in a U.S. Chess League game against Jorge Zamora Haspun. So play this at your own risk with both sides. So the engine loves black. Kaufman seems to warily prefer black, but in terms of actual tournament games, black has gotten just hammered here. So it's a very interesting line. Anyway, that's all I want to say about d5 from this position. Knight a5, I would say, is the main line here. And now, bishop to c2 has been normally just an automatic response, preserving the bishop. But h3 has been tried a few times and was played recently by Satovsky, so it warrants mention. So that game against Gadakamsky, played earlier this year in that ACP Golden Classic tournament where they brought back adjournments and 40 and 2.5 time control. So that game went knight b3, ab3, bishop h5, knight b to d2. Okay, so here I would suggest maybe playing d5 instead of queen d7. We'll look at both these moves. So d5, e5, knight e4, queen c2, knight takes, and In fact, all three recaptures are possible here, but I would say that in every case, the position is roughly equal, though it's an interesting position. I mean, white has play along the c file, black's going to have the bishop here. So I think it's probably easier for most of us to handle white and the c-file pressure, but it'll be a good battle regardless. Anyway, Kamsky shows queen d7, and now instead of whatever it is that Satovsky played, Michalewski in, queen c2, Ruggieri, this is the game. And now, instead of whatever it was that Satovsky played, he got into some trouble in that game, though it ended up as a draw. Michalewski and the computer recommend d5. So Michalewski is on chesspublishing.com. So after d5, c5, takes, queen d3, bishop g6, and then knight to h4. White retains a little bit of pressure here and is getting rid of black's bishop here. So I think white again has some small chances for an edge here. And this is not so bad. So h3 might be worth considering at this point instead of bishop c2. All right. Well, bishop c2 is leads us smack dab into the middle of theory, and here black has a couple of choices: c5 and knight to c4. So let's start with knight c4. So on this, the bishop drops back. So it's kind of an amusing sequence. The one knight drives both bishops back, but that knight will be pushed back in turn. So c5, b3, knight b6, knight b to d7, knight b to d2, and here black has several important moves. There's c takes d4, there's rook c8, and there's knight f to d7, which we'll focus on, with the idea of putting the bishop on the long diagonal. So h3, bishop h5, and here white has chosen g4 and bishop to b2, but we'll focus on a4 as this was the option chosen by Satovsky earlier this year, and also it's the computer's preference. All right, so first of all, there's a pretty high-level correspondence game, Lubicic against Knoll in an ICCF email game in 2008, where black played b takes a4. But I think white's slightly better here. ba, bishop f6, a5, and now putting the knight on c8 would be pretty clumsy. So black made this pseudo sack with c takes d4. So ab, d3, b7, d takes c2, queen c2, rook b8, and rook b1. Material is even, but white's a little bit better. Black has two queenside weaknesses, and it's not clear that the pawn on b7 is a weakness. Maybe it'll drop, but it may not drop for free. So it looks like white's doing a little bit better here. And in fact, white went on to win the game. So instead of b takes a4, c takes d4 was tried in the Satovsky game, Satovsky against Baron from Kalita in 2012. So that game, which white also won, went AB, rook a8, queen a8, g4, and then knight takes d4. Yeah, here Baron played bishop to f6, but maybe rook c8 is better, although I think even after f4, white may still have a slight pull. So it looks like knight to c4 is not a clear equalizer. So c5, we'll stick to the main move, and now white has the choice, and the options are d takes c5 and h3. All right, on d takes c5, I'll just note here that knight to c4 is quite rare, but maybe not bad. This is kind of an interesting idea. Anyway, dc is the standard choice, and here knight b to d2 had been the main move, but it's been supplanted. I think both because knight c3 has done reasonably well, and because knight b to d2 hasn't really achieved any advantage. So knight c6, rook c1, c4, and black is doing great here. You can see that white's position is really quite congested. I mean, all of his pieces are having a difficult time finding anything useful to do. So I would say don't play knight b to d2. Play knight c3. Now, knight c6 has received some attention, but knight c4 is the usual move. And now e5. Okay, knight to d7 is interesting here, but knight takes e5 is not interesting. This is just a blunder. Queen takes d8, knight f3, g takes f3, and the problem is that the bishop on g4 hangs at the end. So the reason I point that out, we'll see in a minute. Okay, if we're just mentioning knight to d7 and condemning knight takes e5, then what should black do? Well, the answer is queen takes d1. Rook a to d1, and now knight to d7. Bishop c1, protecting the b2 pawn, and saving the bishop from exchange. Rook a7, overprotecting the knight on d7, and, well, that's the point. Knight to d5, bishop to d8, b3, takes, knight c takes e5, king g2, and knight to c6. So black is up a pawn, white's got the bishop pair, and a nice presence in the center with the knight on d5 and the rooks on the central files. Black held both times without any trouble in a couple of serious correspondence games, but I think in over-the-board play, white's compensation is sufficient. Well, I think it's sufficient even in the correspondence context, but maybe it's a little bit more than sufficient in practical chess, certainly at the club level. Anyway, it's, you know, I think black is all right here, but you can decide for yourself if you feel comfortable with this or not. All right, so that was d takes c5. Now, h3 I consider the more significant line, and there's an important difference here. Oh, by the way, black can also play bishop f3 and c takes d4 here, but white has done pretty well against both of those moves. So bishop h5 has been, I think, rightly the main move. All right. So now we'll get back to d takes c5 and compare that with dc5 from here in a moment. But first, let's discuss g4. This is the more common move, but I can't see any reason to think that it's better. So bishop g6, knight b to d2, and knight to d7. And it's a complicated position. I mean, a lot of imbalances here. All right, White's most common choice here is d5, which doesn't even make the engine's top 5. The engine's number 2 choice is rook c1, which is also the number 2 move in practice. The engine's top move is e5, but it soon transpires that if anyone's better, it's black. So cd, ed6, d takes e3, de7, ef, king f2, queen b6 check, king g2, rook f to e8, takes, knight to b3, takes, knight f6, rook e5, queen b7. And around here it starts to recognize that white's e-pawn is really just never going to go anywhere, and black is probably a little bit better at this point. So, so much for e5. So let's look at d5 a tiny bit. On this, bishop f6, rook to b1, and I would just say that black really has no serious troubles after either h6, keeping white's goodies off of g5, and also giving the bishop a flight square if need be, or rook to e8. So I think black is fine. It's a very complicated position, but objectively speaking, I don't believe white has any advantage here. So back to this position, and d takes c5. So dc, again, I'll recommend knight c3, knight c4, and now e5. And so this works a bit differently than what we saw without h3 and bishop to h5 interpolated. For one thing, knight takes e5 can be played because the bishop is not going to be threatened at the end of the series. So here, if queen takes d8, knight f3, gf3, there's no f takes g4, so black is just up a pawn for absolutely nothing. Clearly better or maybe winning. Okay, we'll come back to knight takes e5 in a moment. Here, though, one advantage for white is that on queen takes d1, rook a takes d1, this time black cannot play knight to d7 because the bishop is not protecting it. So when the bishop was on g4, knight d7 was fine. Here it would just lose a knight. So white or black has to play bishop takes f3 now, but here e takes f6, bishop f6, gf3, knight b2, knight d5, or knight e4, same thing. Takes. And after all of these captures, white has the bishop pair for the rook and a pawn. I'm sure a draw is the correct result here, but again, I would put I would stake my fortunes on the bishop pair rather than on the rook. So yeah, I wouldn't want to go this way for black if I had the option. So again, I think it should be a draw, but I wouldn't want to have to prove it. All right, so knight takes e5 is the right move here. And we already saw queen takes d8 is no good, so the move that white plays now is g4. Okay, knight f3 is forced. Queen f3. Well, okay, I shouldn't say that. I suppose you could play queen takes d1 as well. White plays bishop takes. But the problem there is that after knight f3, bishop f3, your rook on a8 is hanging. So knight f3 really is forced. Queen f3, bishop g6, rook a to d1, queen c8. And white really has nothing better than to take. F takes, a4. And white has enough for the pawn, maybe even a tiny bit more, but not much more. So it's certainly a playable position for both sides. I suppose I would prefer to have white very slightly, but whether this promises white more of an advantage than avoiding the Yates in the first place, that's another question. And I'm not even sure that I could really call this an advantage. So this is not so bad for white, though. It's certainly very playable. Maybe black is best served back here by playing d5. So I'm not sure, but at least as far as I could tell, I was getting more equal positions for black by playing d5. But certainly, again, both lines are playable for black. Anyway, it's a very interesting sideline, the Yates. I mean, well, calling it a sideline is maybe a bit unfair. I mean, it is a major line in its own right. It's just that h3 is just more popular, that's all. So, if you want to avoid theory, d4 is not bad. It also, as I said, gives you an anti-Marshall system that you're ready to go with right away. So it's an important and useful and interesting variation that white can play. Give it a try. You know, it's not bad, but we'll get to the absolute main lines with h3 starting next time. So thanks a lot. Hope you're enjoying the series. We've only got 3 to go. See you next time. Bye-bye.